One man, one I one city at 2200 hours on April 13th, 1945. Corporal Léo Major lay motionless inside a cold drainage ditch just outside the Dutch city of Zwolle. His body pressed deep into the damp earth as he stared toward the silent skyline ahead. A skyline that looked calm, almost peaceful from a distance, but hid a reality far more dangerous because somewhere inside those narrow streets and darkened buildings, nearly 90 German soldiers controlled every intersection, every bridge, every approach into the city. While 50,000 Dutch civilians remained trapped inside, families hiding in basements, children clinging to their parents, entire lives suspended in fear, unaware that by dawn the Canadian Army had already planned something devastating, something final. A full artillery bombardment designed to wipe out resistance completely, leveling buildings, collapsing streets, and killing anyone caught in the blast, regardless of whether they were soldiers or civilians, a standard military procedure used throughout the war to avoid costly urban combat, efficient, brutal, and effective. But as Léo watched the city from the ditch, he wasn't thinking about efficiency or military doctrine. He was thinking about what would be lost when those shells started falling, the homes that would turn to rubble, the voices that would be silenced, the thousands of innocent people who would never get the chance to survive a war they didn't choose to be part of. And his orders, the ones given to him just hours earlier, suddenly felt heavier than ever because they were simple, clear, and left no room for interpretation. Enter the outskirts, scout German positions, report back, and let the artillery handle the rest. But at 22:15 hours, before he could even complete the first phase of that mission, everything changed in an instant when the sharp, violent burst of an MG-42 machine gun ripped through the night, the sound echoing with terrifying speed and precision. And before Léo could react, before he could even fully process what was happening, Private Willie Arsenault, his spotter, his partner, the man who had fought beside him through months of combat, was struck by a burst of rounds that dropped him instantly to the ground. And Léo rushed to him without hesitation, dropping to his knees, grabbing him, trying to assess the damage. But the moment he saw the wounds, the stillness, the absence of any response, he knew it was already over. Arsenault was gone, killed in seconds by a weapon designed to leave no second chances. And for a brief moment, time seemed to slow, the noise of the battlefield fading into the background as Léo knelt there beside his friend, remembering the conversations they had shared, the promises they had made about going home after the war, about Quebec, about life beyond the fighting, promises that now meant nothing in the face of what had just happened. And he stayed there only for a few seconds, not long enough to grieve properly, but long enough to understand one thing with absolute clarity if he followed his orders. If he pulled back and allowed the artillery to strike at dawn, then Arsenault's death would be just one of thousands that night, lost in a larger destruction that would erase the entire city. And slowly, without saying a word, Léo stood up, his gaze fixed on Zwolle once again. And in that moment he made a decision that went against everything he had been trained to do, everything the Canadian Army expected of him, because he wasn't going back, he wasn't reporting in, and he wasn't calling for artillery support. Instead, he chose to do something that should have been impossible, something no soldier was ever supposed to attempt alone. He decided he would enter the city by himself and force the German garrison to abandon it before dawn, not through overwhelming firepower, not through coordinated assault, but through fear, confusion, and relentless pressure. A plan that made no logical sense on paper. One man against nearly 90 enemy soldiers in an unfamiliar city at night. But Léo Major was not an ordinary soldier, and his past had already proven that, because months earlier during the Normandy campaign he had survived a phosphorus grenade explosion that destroyed his right eye and burned part of his face, an injury that should have ended his war immediately, the kind of wound that sent most soldiers home permanently. But when doctors told him he would be discharged, Léo refused without hesitation, insisting that he was still capable of fighting, reportedly telling them he only needed one eye to aim and shoot. And that refusal brought him here, standing on the edge of another impossible situation, with only that one eye left, his depth perception compromised, his body already pushed beyond normal limits, yet still determined to continue. And as he checked his equipment, a Sten submachine gun, a limited number of magazines, a few grenades, and a knife, he understood that he didn't have enough firepower to win a direct fight. But that wasn't his intention, because what he had learned over 18 months of combat was that war was not just about bullets or numbers. It was about perception, about what the enemy believed to be true. And if he could make the Germans believe they were facing a much larger force, if he could create enough noise, enough chaos, enough unpredictability, then their discipline would break, their confidence would collapse, and they would begin to retreat without ever realizing the truth. And so at 22:30 hours, Léo Major stepped out of the ditch and began walking towards Zwolle. not running, not rushing, but moving with controlled determination, entering the city through its outer edges, staying close to shadows, using the darkness to conceal his movements as he studied the layout around him, memorizing streets, counting buildings, identifying possible routes for movement and escape, because once he started his plan there would be no time to think, only to act, and within minutes he found his first target, a small German supply post guarded by 2 soldiers who stood outside smoking, completely unaware of the danger approaching them, and Leo raised his weapon, aimed carefully, and fired a short controlled burst that dropped both men instantly, eliminating them before they could react. And without wasting a second, he pulled a grenade from his belt and threw it through the window of the building. The explosion that followed tearing through the interior and igniting ammunition stored inside, causing a chain reaction of smaller detonations as bullets fired randomly in every direction, creating an overwhelming noise that echoed through the narrow streets and bounced off the surrounding buildings, amplifying the chaos far beyond the scale of the actual attack, exactly the effect Leo needed. But he didn't stay to observe it. Instead, he moved immediately, running several blocks away before stopping again to fire his weapon into the air, then moving again, changing direction, striking from another angle, repeating the process over and over, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to track him, and within minutes the city began to react. German soldiers rushed into the streets, shouting orders, trying to identify where the attack was coming from, but they couldn't, because there was no clear pattern, no visible formation, just gunfire and explosions erupting from different directions at unpredictable intervals. And as Leo continued moving through Zwolle, attacking isolated targets, firing short bursts, creating noise and disappearing into the darkness before anyone could respond, the confusion among the German forces began to grow. Officers attempted to organize their men, shouting commands, trying to establish defensive positions, but nothing made sense. Because this wasn't how an attack was supposed to look. There was no front line, no coordinated push, no visible enemy force. Just chaos spreading through the city like something they couldn't control. And as the minutes passed, the psychological impact of Leo's actions became more significant than the physical damage he was causing. Because the Germans no longer believed they were facing a single attacker. They believed they were under attack by a much larger Canadian force that had already infiltrated the city, surrounding them from all sides. And that belief began to erode their confidence, turning trained soldiers into uncertain men reacting to fear rather than orders. And as Leo paused briefly in the shadows to reload his weapon and check his remaining ammunition, he realized something critical, something that confirmed his plan was working. He didn't need to kill every soldier. He didn't need to control every street. He only needed to maintain the illusion, because the real battle wasn't being fought with bullets anymore. It was being fought in the minds of the enemy, and in that battle, Leo Major was already winged. The night turns into chaos. The hunt begins by 2300 hours. The city of Zwolle was no longer quiet, no longer controlled, and no longer predictable, because what had started as a single calculated act of disruption had now grown into something far larger, something the German soldiers inside the city could neither see nor understand. As explosions echoed through the streets, gunfire erupted from different directions, and shadows seemed to move with purpose, creating the terrifying illusion of a full-scale invasion already underway. And in the middle of it all was one man, Corporal Léo Major, moving faster than anyone could track, striking positions, disappearing, and reappearing somewhere else before the enemy could respond. His entire strategy built on momentum, because the moment he slowed down, the moment the Germans began to understand the pattern, everything would collapse, and he would be surrounded, outnumbered, and killed within minutes. So he kept moving, constantly shifting direction. Short bursts, targeting isolated positions, never staying long enough to confirm results, because the outcome of each attack didn't matter as much as the noise it created, the confusion it spread, and the fear it planted in the minds of the enemy. And already that fear was taking hold. German soldiers were shouting over each other, officers trying to regain control, issuing orders that conflicted with the reality around them, because nothing about this attack followed the rules they had trained for. There was no visible front line, no coordinated advance, no identifiable enemy force. Only chaos, only uncertainty. And that uncertainty began to fracture their discipline, turning organized defense into scattered reactions as soldiers fired into the darkness at targets they couldn't see, wasting ammunition, exposing positions, and feeding the illusion that they were under attack from multiple directions at once. Leo could hear it all as he moved through the streets, the confusion, the panic, the breakdown of command. And he understood that this was the moment where his plan either succeeded or failed, because psychological pressure was building, but it needed to reach a breaking point. And to do that, he had to escalate. He had to make the situation feel even bigger, even more overwhelming than it already was. So he began targeting more critical locations, moving deeper into the city, striking supply points, firing at vehicles, creating secondary explosions that echoed far beyond their actual size, each blast reinforcing the illusion that a larger force was closing in, surrounding the Germans, cutting off their ability to respond effectively. And for a while it worked perfectly. The Germans were reacting exactly as he had hoped, pulling back from positions, abandoning posts, clustering together in confusion, trying to regroup against an enemy they couldn't locate. But then something changed, something that threatened to undo everything he had built so far. Because in the distance, cutting through the noise and chaos, Leo heard a sound that immediately shifted the balance: a sharp, aggressive barking, followed by shouted commands in German. The unmistakable signal of patrol dogs being deployed. And unlike the soldiers, the dogs didn't rely on sight or confusion. They relied on scent. And once they picked up his trail, the illusion wouldn't matter anymore, because they would lead their handlers directly to him, turning a psychological operation into a direct confrontation he could not win. The barking grew louder, closer, more focused, and Leo knew immediately that he had limited time to react, because once the dogs locked onto his position, they would close the distance quickly, and the soldiers behind them would follow, organized, alert, and ready to engage. So he moved, not just fast, but strategically, cutting through narrow streets, turning sharply at intersections, trying to break his scent trail while maintaining the pace of his attacks. But the dogs kept coming, their barking sharper now, more aggressive, signaling that they were closing in, and within moments Leo could hear the handlers as well, shouting commands, coordinating their movement, tightening the search area around him, forcing him into a situation he had been trying to avoid all night, a direct chase through enemy-controlled territory. And for the next several minutes, the operation transformed from calculated disruption into pure survival as Leo ran through the dark streets of Zwolle, moving through alleys, slipping between buildings, jumping over obstacles, doing everything he could to stay ahead of the dogs that were now dangerously close behind him, close enough that he could hear their breathing, their claws hitting the pavement, their handlers gaining ground, and every second that passed reduced his options because he couldn't stop to fight, couldn't risk turning around to engage, not with limited ammunition and no clear advantage, so he kept moving, pushing himself harder, ignoring the fatigue building in his body, the cold air cutting into his lungs, the constant awareness that one mistake, one wrong turn would end everything. And as the chase intensified, Leo realized that he needed something drastic, something unpredictable, something that would break the dog's advantage completely. Because if he continued like this, they would eventually catch him. And when they did, the night would end not with the liberation of a city, but with the death of a single soldier whose plan had come within inches of success. The edge of survival at approximately 23:30 hours, after nearly 15 minutes of constant movement and relentless pursuit, Leo reached the edge of a canal that cut through the city, its dark water reflecting faint traces of firelight from the chaos behind him. And he stopped for just a fraction of a second, evaluating the situation in front of him. Because the canal was wide, too wide to jump safely under normal conditions. Behind him, the dogs were closing in rapidly, their barking now almost on top of him, their handlers just seconds away from visual contact. And in that moment, Leo understood that there were no good options left, no safe choices. Only a decision between immediate capture or a desperate gamble, and without hesitation, he chose the gamble, launching himself forward into the cold, black water below, the impact hitting him like a shockwave as the freezing temperature cut through his uniform instantly, stealing his breath, tightening his muscles, threatening to lock his body in place. But he forced himself to move, pushing through the water, dragging himself toward the opposite bank, while behind him the dogs reached the edge and stopped, barking violently but unwilling to follow into the freezing canal, their handlers arriving seconds later, shouting, searching, firing blindly into the darkness where Leo had disappeared, but missing their target completely as he pulled himself out of the water on the other side, soaked, freezing, and barely able to feel his hands, yet still alive, still ahead, still in control of his fate. But survival came at a cost, because as Leo caught his breath and checked his weapon, he realized immediately that the water had done more damage than the enemy had. His Sten gun soaked through, the mechanism compromised, the ammunition potentially ruined, and when he attempted to fire, pulling the trigger with careful precision, there was nothing. Just a hollow click, a dead weapon in his hands. And in that moment, the reality of his situation became even more dangerous than before, because now he was deep inside an enemy-held city, alone, exhausted, freezing, and effectively unarmed, with dozens of German soldiers still searching for him, still reacting to the chaos he had created, but now with the advantage of knowing there was at least one attacker somewhere inside the city. And Leo understood that if he didn't adapt quickly, if he didn't replace his weapon and regain his ability to fight, the entire mission would collapse. So instead of retreating, instead of hiding, he made another decision that defied logic. He turned back toward the danger, moving carefully along the canal, staying low, using whatever cover he could find as he searched for an opportunity, and eventually he found it. A small German patrol moving along the opposite side, 3 soldiers, cautious but unaware of how close they were to the man they had been chasing, and Leo waited, controlling his breathing, letting them come closer, closer, until they were within reach. And then he moved, silently, quickly, grabbing the nearest soldier from behind, pulling him off balance, cutting off his ability to shout, and in the struggle that followed, Leo overpowered him, taking his rifle, eliminating the immediate threat while the other soldiers reacted too late to stop him. And within seconds, Leo had what he needed, a functioning weapon, fresh ammunition, and the ability to continue the fight. With the rifle now in his hands, Leo didn't hesitate, because hesitation meant losing momentum, and momentum was the only thing keeping his entire operation alive. So he reloaded, checked the weapon, and moved back into the city, colder, more exhausted. But more dangerous than before, because now the situation had shifted again. The Germans were no longer just confused. They were unsettled, shaken by an enemy that refused to disappear, that kept striking, adapting, surviving against all odds. And Leo intended to push that fear even further, to drive it to the point where it would break completely, forcing the remaining German forces to abandon the city before dawn, because time was still against him. The artillery was still coming, and every minute that passed brought Zwolle closer to destruction. And as he disappeared back into the shadows, rifle ready, eyes scanning, mind focused on the next move, one thing had become clear. This was no longer just a mission. It was a fight against time, against fear, and against impossible odds. And Leo Major had no intention of losing. The city starts to break fire in the heart of the city. By the time Leo Major re-entered the deeper sections of Zwolle, the city was no longer reacting with confusion alone. It was beginning to fracture under pressure. Because what had started as scattered chaos was now evolving into something far more dangerous for the German forces. A growing belief that they were facing a coordinated assault that had already penetrated their defenses. And Leo understood that this was the moment where everything could shift, the point where fear could turn into collapse if he pushed hard enough. So instead of slowing down, instead of conserving his limited resources, he made the deliberate decision to escalate, to strike at something that would carry both tactical and psychological weight. Something that would send a message across the entire city in one single moment. And as he moved carefully through the streets, staying within the shadows while scanning every intersection, he found exactly what he needed: the Gestapo headquarters. A 3-story building standing near the center of Zwolle, its windows still lit, its structure intact, a symbol of German authority and control within the city. And even from a distance, Leo could see movement inside. Officers working over maps, soldiers moving in and out, the kind of location that held not just personnel but command, coordination, and confidence. And if he could disrupt that, if he could destroy that center of control, the effect would ripple outward through every remaining German unit in the city. He approached slowly, carefully, observing the guards positioned outside, noting their patterns, their spacing, their attention focused outward toward the chaos already spreading through the streets, completely unaware that the source of that chaos was now closing in on their most important position. And without hesitation, Leo initiated the attack, throwing a grenade toward the entrance with precise timing, the explosion erupting violently and instantly eliminating the guards while sending a shockwave through the building itself. And before the smoke even cleared, he followed with gunfire, targeting the windows, shattering glass, forcing anyone inside to react blindly. And for a brief moment, the entire structure seemed to come alive with panic, voices shouting, orders being issued, footsteps rushing in every direction. But Leo didn't stop, because stopping would allow them to regroup, and instead he pressed the attack further, moving positions, firing again, making it sound like multiple soldiers were surrounding the building. And then, in a move that carried even greater impact, he ignited the structure, setting fire to the lower level using whatever fuel and materials he could find. And within minutes, flames began to spread, climbing walls, consuming rooms. forcing everyone inside to make a choice: stay and fight or abandon the building entirely, and they chose to run, officers and soldiers alike pouring out into the streets, disorganized, desperate, abandoning their command center without fully understanding what they were facing. And as they fled into the darkness, the burning headquarters behind them became more than just a destroyed building. It became a signal, a visible, undeniable sign that control of the city was slipping away. Fear takes control. The fire from the Gestapo headquarters spread quickly, its flames rising into the night sky, casting an orange glow over the surrounding streets, illuminating smoke that could be seen from nearly every corner of Zwolle. And for the German soldiers still scattered throughout the city, that fire became something far more powerful than its physical destruction. It became proof that their command structure had been hit, that the center of their operations was no longer secure, and as that realization spread, so did the fear. Because without clear leadership, without communication, the situation transformed from a defensive position into a survival scenario, and Leo understood this shift as he moved through the streets once again, listening, observing, recognizing the change in behavior. Because now the gunfire was less controlled, less strategic, more reactive, soldiers firing at shadows, calling out to each other with uncertainty in their voices, trying to regroup but lacking direction. And that lack of direction was exactly what Leo needed to exploit. He continued his movement pattern, striking where he could, creating noise, reinforcing the illusion that the attack was ongoing and expanding. And with each action, the psychological pressure increased, because the Germans were no longer just confused. They were beginning to lose confidence entirely, unsure of where the enemy was, unsure of how many attackers they were facing, unsure of whether they were already surrounded. And in war, uncertainty is one of the most dangerous conditions a soldier can face, because it erodes decision-making, slows reactions, and replaces discipline with instinct. And instinct, when driven by fear, often leads to retreat, and that is exactly what began to happen. Small groups of soldiers started pulling back from their positions, abandoning posts they had been ordered to defend, moving toward what they believed were safer locations. But in doing so, they created gaps, openings that Leo could exploit further. And as he moved through these shifting lines, he wasn't just attacking anymore. He was shaping the battlefield, guiding the enemy's reactions without them realizing it, pushing them toward the outcome he needed. At the same time, the civilians hidden within the city began to sense the change as well. The pattern of explosions, the movement of German soldiers, the distant sounds of retreat rather than advance. And although they didn't know exactly what was happening, they understood that something was different, that the occupation they had endured for so long was beginning to weaken. And that realization spread quietly through basements and hidden rooms, whispers replacing silence, hope beginning to emerge where fear had dominated for months. And Leo, moving through the streets above them, was the unseen force driving that change, a single soldier creating the conditions for an entire city to believe in liberation before it had officially arrived. The breaking point approaches. By the time the clock moved past midnight, Léo Major had been inside Zwolle for hours, and the cumulative effect of his actions was becoming impossible for the German forces to ignore, because what they were experiencing no longer felt like an isolated series of attacks. It felt like a coordinated offensive that had already penetrated their defenses and was now dismantling their ability to respond. And Leo knew that he was close to achieving something critical, something that would determine whether the city survived the night intact or was reduced to rubble by morning. But he also understood that the situation was still fragile, because as long as organized resistance remained, as long as pockets of German soldiers held their positions, there was still a risk that the illusion would break, that someone would realize the truth, that the entire operation was being driven by one man rather than an entire force. And if that realization spread, the balance would shift instantly, turning fear into aggression and chaos into coordinated defense. So he made the decision to push harder, to target the remaining strong points within the city, locations where German soldiers were still holding together, still attempting to organize, still resisting the growing pressure around them. And as he moved toward these positions, he relied on everything he had learned throughout the night: speed, unpredictability, controlled aggression, striking quickly, creating maximum noise and disruption before disappearing again, never allowing the enemy to fully engage, never giving them a clear target. And with each attack, the remaining resistance weakened further, because the soldiers defending those positions were already shaken, already uncertain. And the continued pressure only accelerated their collapse, forcing them to abandon their posts one by one, retreating deeper into the city or attempting to escape entirely. At the same time, Leo's own condition was becoming a factor he could no longer ignore. His body pushed to its limits by hours of constant movement, combat, and exposure to the cold, his muscles tightening, his energy draining, but he didn't stop, because he knew that stopping meant losing everything he had built. losing the momentum that had carried him this far and allowing the Germans time to recover, time to regroup, time to realize the truth. And so he kept moving, driven not just by determination but by necessity, because the stakes were no longer limited to his survival. They extended to every civilian inside the city, to the outcome of the entire mission, to whether Zwolle would still be standing when the sun rose. And as he prepared for the next phase of his operation, moving toward the remaining German positions that still held out against the growing collapse, one thing had become clear: the city was on the edge. The German forces were close to breaking completely, and Léo Major, alone in the darkness, was the force pushing them toward that final moment. The night the city surrendered, the last defense collapses by the time the night pushed deeper past 1:30 a.m. The city of Zwolle had reached a point where it no longer resembled an organized defensive position, but instead felt like a structure collapsing from within. Because every explosion, every burst of gunfire, every shadow-driven movement had slowly dismantled the German soldiers' sense of control. And although small pockets of resistance still remained, they were no longer coordinated, no longer confident, and no longer certain of what they were actually facing. And Léo Major could feel that shift as he moved through the streets once again, his breathing steady despite the exhaustion building in his body, his movement still controlled despite the cold gripping his muscles, because he understood something critical at that moment. He wasn't fighting for dominance anymore, he was pushing for collapse. And collapse didn't require eliminating every soldier, it required breaking their will to continue, and that breaking point was closer than ever. He moved toward one of the final known strongpoints, a German barracks located on the western side of the city. A building that still showed signs of organized activity, lights flickering behind covered windows, shadows moving with purpose, soldiers gathering equipment, possibly preparing to either defend their position or retreat in a controlled manner. And Léo knew that if they managed to regroup here, if they managed to stabilize even a small portion of their forces, it could slow everything down. It could give the Germans just enough confidence to resist until dawn. And dawn meant artillery, and artillery meant the destruction of the entire city. So he didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the perfect moment. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He walked directly toward the entrance in full view, not hiding, not sneaking, but advancing openly as if he had an entire force behind him. And that single act alone created hesitation among the guards. Because it didn't match the behavior of a lone attacker, it looked like the confidence of someone who knew they were supported, and in that hesitation Léo struck, firing with precision, eliminating the guards before they could fully react, and then he pushed inside. The interior of the barracks erupted into chaos instantly, soldiers turning, shouting, grabbing weapons, trying to understand how an enemy had breached their position so suddenly, and Léo didn't give them time to process it. He moved quickly, firing controlled shots, using cover, shifting positions, making it sound like multiple attackers were inside the building, and within seconds the structured defense the Germans had attempted to build inside that barracks collapsed into confusion. Some soldiers trying to fight, others attempting to retreat, officers shouting conflicting orders, unable to determine where the attack was coming from or how many enemies they were facing. And Léo used that confusion to its fullest extent, moving through the building with calculated aggression, striking just enough to maintain pressure without getting pinned down, forcing the soldiers inside to react rather than think. And as the seconds turned into minutes, the resistance inside the barracks began to crumble completely, soldiers abandoning their positions, rushing toward exits, fleeing into the streets in an attempt to escape what they believed was an overwhelming assault force. And as they ran, they left behind weapons, ammunition, and most importantly, their confidence. And Léo, standing in the aftermath of that collapse, understood that he had just broken the largest remaining organized group within the city. The city gives up by 2:30 a.m. The transformation of Zwolle was undeniable, because what had once been an occupied city under German control had now become a space filled with uncertainty, fear, and the growing realization that the occupation was ending. And Léo Major, despite the exhaustion pulling at his body, continued to move, because he knew that the final phase was the most important. The moment where everything could either solidify into victory or fall apart completely if he lost momentum. And so he pushed forward, targeting the last remaining positions, motor pools, supply points, isolated groups of soldiers still attempting to hold ground. And with each action he reinforced the same message, the same illusion that had carried him this far, that the Canadians were already inside the city in force, that resistance was pointless, that survival meant retreat. Then something unexpected happened. Something that marked the true turning point of the entire night. Because as Léo moved through one of the central streets, weapon ready, senses alert, prepared for another engagement, he saw movement ahead that didn't match the pattern of combat. a figure stepping forward slowly, deliberately, hands raised, unarmed, and behind that figure, more soldiers emerging, also unarmed, also raising their hands. And for a brief moment, the tension of the night seemed to pause, because this was something different, something that hadn't happened before. And as the figure came closer, Leo could see the uniform clearly, a German officer, likely a captain, his expression serious but not defiant, his posture controlled but unmistakably surrendering. And when he spoke, his voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and acceptance as he declared that they were surrendering the city, all of it, that they understood they were outmatched, surrounded, and unable to continue fighting against what they believed was a much larger Canadian force. Leo didn't lower his weapon immediately, didn't reveal the truth, didn't break the illusion that had driven everything to this point, because he understood that the belief itself was the weapon now. And as he questioned the officer, confirming the number of remaining soldiers, confirming their positions, he maintained that pressure, that presence, that image of control, and the officer, convinced of the situation, cooperated fully, explaining that the remaining troops were prepared to surrender as well, that they had no intention of continuing a fight they believed they could not win. And in that moment, without a final battle, without a decisive firefight, of Zwolle effectively fell, not to an army, not to a coordinated assault, but to the perception of one man, one victory, as the final group of German soldiers gathered at the bridge, placing their weapons on the ground, forming lines under the assumption that they were surrendering to a larger force, waiting beyond the darkness. Leo Major stood there alone, his weapon still raised, his single eye scanning the scene carefully, ensuring there were no sudden movements, no last-minute attempts to resist. And one by one, the soldiers complied, stepping back, hands visible, following orders given not by a commanding officer of an army, but by a single corporal who had managed to control an entire battlefield through nothing but strategy, movement, and psychological pressure. And as they began to move out of the city, retreating toward their own lines, leaving Zwolle behind, the reality of what had just happened settled into the silence that followed, because the gunfire had stopped, the explosions had faded, and for the first time in hours, the city was quiet again. Leo watched them go, counting them, confirming that the last organized resistance had left, that there was no one left to fight, no one left to hold the city. And when he was certain, when the final soldier disappeared into the darkness, he finally allowed himself to lower his weapon, his body reacting immediately to the release of tension, exhaustion hitting him all at once. The cold, the fatigue, the weight of everything he had just done catching up to him in a single overwhelming moment, and he sat down on the edge of the bridge, alone in the city he had just liberated, his uniform still wet, his hands still cold, his body pushed beyond its limits, but alive, and more importantly, successful. Behind him, Zwolle still stood, its buildings intact, its streets unbroken, its civilians alive, unaware that the destruction planned for dawn had just been prevented by one man who refused to follow orders. And as the first signs of early morning approached, as the sky began to lighten just enough to signal the coming day, Leo Major remained there, sitting in silence, knowing that in a few hours the Canadian army would arrive expecting a battle, expecting resistance, expecting destruction, and instead they would find a city already free, a victory already achieved, and a story that would be almost impossible to believe, that one soldier alone, with one eye and limited ammunition, had walked into an occupied city and forced an entire garrison to surrender without ever revealing the truth. The legend that history could not ignore the morning that changed everything, as the first light of dawn slowly began to rise over the city of Zwolle on April 14, 1945. The darkness that had hidden the chaos of the night started to fade, revealing something no one had expected to see: a city still standing, its buildings intact, its streets scarred but not destroyed, and its people alive, because just hours earlier, everything pointed toward a completely different outcome. One where artillery shells would rain down without mercy, where entire neighborhoods would be reduced to rubble, and where thousands of civilians would have been caught in the destruction. But instead, the morning arrived in silence, a silence that felt almost unreal after the intensity of the night. And as that silence settled over the city, the first signs of life began to emerge, doors opening cautiously, people stepping out into the streets, looking around with uncertainty, trying to understand what had happened, because they had heard the explosions, the gunfire, the chaos that had unfolded throughout the night. They had expected the worst, prepared themselves for destruction, and yet somehow, against all logic, the destruction never came. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the city, the Canadian Army prepared to move in at 600 hours, expecting resistance, expecting to fight their way street by street, building by building, just as they had done in countless other towns throughout the war. their plans already set, their expectations grounded in experience, because nothing about this situation suggested that the city would fall without a fight. And yet when they advanced, when they entered Zwolle expecting gunfire, they were met with something entirely different, something almost impossible to comprehend. There were no German defenses, no organized resistance, no prepared positions, only abandoned equipment, empty streets, and civilians emerging from hiding, waving, cheering, crying, realizing that they had been liberated without the destruction they had feared. And as the soldiers moved deeper into the city, trying to piece together what had happened, one question began to surface again and again: how? The answer, when it finally reached them, didn't make sense at first, because it sounded more like a story than a report, more like something exaggerated than something real, that a single Canadian corporal had entered the city alone, created chaos, destroyed key positions, and convinced the entire German garrison that they were under attack by a much larger force, forcing them to retreat and ultimately surrender without a full-scale battle. And for a moment, even the officers struggled to accept it, because war didn't work like that. Victories of that scale required coordination, numbers, planning, and yet as more details emerged, as resistance fighters and civilians confirmed what they had seen and heard throughout the night, the truth became undeniable. One man had done what an entire unit was expected to do, and he had done it in a way no one had anticipated. The man who walked away from glory, Corporal Léo Major, the man at the center of it all, didn't wait for recognition, didn't stay to explain, didn't stand in the streets accepting praise. Because by the time the Canadian forces fully entered Zwolle, he had already begun moving back toward his own lines, his body exhausted, his uniform still soaked from the canal, his hands worn and cold, carrying with him not pride, not celebration, but the quiet understanding that his mission was complete. And when he finally reported what had happened, when he explained the sequence of events, the attacks, the movement, the surrender, there was initial disbelief, questions about accuracy, assumptions that exhaustion or shock might have influenced his account, because the scale of what he described didn't match what anyone expected from a single soldier operating alone. But the evidence inside the city told the same story: the abandoned positions, the burned headquarters, the scattered equipment, and the testimonies from civilians and resistance members who had witnessed the chaos of the night all pointed to the same conclusion. Recognition followed, as it always does when something extraordinary cannot be ignored, because the Canadian Army submitted his name for one of its highest honors, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, a recognition reserved for acts of exceptional bravery and impact. And this was not his first, because Léo Major had already earned one earlier in the war, making him one of the very few soldiers to receive the medal twice, a rare distinction that placed him among the most remarkable individuals to serve during the conflict. But even in that moment, even with recognition and honor being placed in front of him, Léo remained unchanged, because he didn't see himself as a hero in the way others did. He saw himself as a soldier who had made a decision, a soldier who had refused to accept an outcome that didn't sit right with him. And when the opportunity came for a formal presentation, for ceremony, for acknowledgement at the highest level, he declined, choosing instead to step away from the spotlight to avoid the attention that followed his actions. He returned home after the war, back to a life that stood in complete contrast to what he had experienced, working, raising a family, living quietly, rarely speaking about what had happened in Zwolle, because for him it wasn't a story to be told for recognition. It was a moment that had passed, a decision that had been made, and a mission that had been completed. And while others saw it as one of the most extraordinary acts of individual action during the war, Léo treated it as something far simpler. Something that didn't need to be explained or repeated, something that existed in the past and stayed there. A legacy that never faded. But while Léo Major chose to move forward quietly, the city of Zwolle did not forget, because for the people who lived there, for the families who had survived that night, his actions were not just a military success, they were the difference between life and death, between destruction and survival. And over time, as the years passed and the war became history, the story of what happened on that night continued to grow, passed down through generations, remembered not just as an event, but as a moment that defined what was possible when one person refused to accept the expected outcome. And the city honored him in ways that ensured his actions would never be lost, naming a street after him, inviting him back years later, celebrating not just the liberation of the city, but the way it had been achieved. When Léo eventually returned to Zwolle decades after the war, he was met with something he had never sought: recognition, not from military officials or formal ceremonies, but from the people whose lives had been directly impacted by what he had done. Crowds gathering, individuals approaching him not with questions, but with gratitude, with emotion, with the understanding that their lives, Their families, their futures existed because of a decision he had made in the darkness of that night, and in that moment the scale of his actions became something more than a military achievement. It became a human story. One that connected a single act of courage to thousands of lives that continued because of it. Léo Major lived many years after the war, carrying with him a story that few could fully understand, a story that stood apart not because of its scale, but because of how it was achieved, because in a war defined by massive operations, coordinated assaults, and overwhelming force, his story was different, it was personal, it was individual. It was proof that sometimes the outcome of something much larger can depend on the actions of one person willing to take a risk that no one else would take. And when he passed away, the story did not end, because it had already become part of history, part of the identity of a sea, part of the legacy of a soldier who proved that courage is not measured by numbers, not defined by rank, and not limited by circumstance, but by the willingness to act when it matters most. And even now, long after the war has ended, long after the events of that night have become history, the story remains, remembered by those who study it, those who tell it, and those who understand what it represents, because the night Léo Major walked into Zwolle was not just about one city or one battle. It was about a moment where the impossible became real, where one man changed the outcome of thousands of lives, and where history recorded something rare, something extraordinary, something that continues to stand as a reminder that sometimes, when everything depends on it, one person is enough.